Sorry to interrupt the honourable member. I call Stephen Browning.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I rise to speak to the Fisheries, Foreign Charter Vessels and Other Matters Amendment Bill. This bill implements decisions on the regulation of foreign chartered vessels following the allegations and then the recommendations of the ministerial inquiry that followed. It requires that all vessels are flagged as New Zealand ships from 1st of May 2016. We think it should be a little bit quicker, but the bill is a move in the right direction. It strengthens the Chief Executive's power to consider a wide range of matters when consenting to foreign chartered vessel applications, and these matters extend from fisheries management matters to employment and vessel safety conditions. So that bringing together those different aspects is very important, and it's a very timely move. The bill extends the functions of observers, and I'll talk about that a bit more, on foreign chartered vessels to collecting information on employment and vessel safety conditions. And it begins with a phase-out of foreign chartered vessels in New Zealand waters, which is a good thing. It unfortunately takes a few years, I've said, to get to that point. There are some gaps in the bill, and we'll be looking forward to the Select Committee to hopefully addressing some of those. Around the crew of the foreign chartered vessels, their pay, their health, safety conditions, they all need to be lifted in terms of this bill. And while the breaches will be more readily reported, this bill fails to address many of the issues raised in the inquiry. Migrant fishing crew working on foreign chartered vessels fishing in New Zealand waters have been exploited over 2 decades. Research reveals human rights abuses, forced labour, exploitative and appalling conditions, coupled with an absence of accountability despite legislation. National Party's links with the fishing industry should be looked at as well. In response to the noise from the other side, maybe I need to repeat that. The crews come to New Zealand with the goal of earning a decent income. Instead, they become victims of forced labour by fishing companies associated with others in this House. If decisive action had been taken when accounts of fishing crew exploitation first emerged in the 1990s, recent shocking incidents of abuse that have been in our media could have been avoided. Globally, the fishing industry is home to some of the worst examples of abuse in the workplace, and it is to our shame that New Zealand waters have been the scene of some of this abuse. Countries such as Indonesia provide a ready pool of impoverished migrant workers to our fishing industry. The nature of the employment itself, fishing vessels operating at sea for months on end with little, if any, regulatory oversight means transparency and accountability is problematic. New Zealand Department of Labour must also take responsibility for poor enforcement of our weak laws. In 1999, a case initiated by over 100 crews from 3 vessels went to the Court of Appeal, and despite a series of investigations, the Department of Labour undertook no prosecutions. The question has to be, who were they taking instruction from? The exploitation of foreign fishing crew has been a feature of the New Zealand deep sea industry for decades, unfortunately. New Zealand fishing companies began using foreign chartered vessels in the late 1970s to help them develop the deep water fisheries, and many of them are crewed by migrant Asian workers, and we've said particularly Indonesians. 2004, over 150 foreign crew again abandoned their vessels, leading to yet another investigation by the Department of Labour, which reconfirmed the appalling exploitation of foreign workers. Subsequently, a non-binding code of practice in 2006 and an auditing program in 2007 were introduced, but of course the problems in this industry just continued. Codes of practice, yeah right, things just carry on. Many crew in our waters come from impoverished regions of Indonesia, and we'll talk about that. These crew became victims of forced labour at the recruitment stage. They are misled into providing guarantees and securities to a staffing agency and may also have to pay a cash bond before they're allowed to sign their employment agreements. They're then required to hand over birth certificates, family identity documents and education certificates to these agents. Many who have flown to New Zealand with the cost of visa fees and transportation at an inflated level deducted from future wages. This happens after signing employment contracts that lock them into a form of slavery. Crew on these ships are required to sign blank timesheets. Work by New Zealand researchers has also found wage fraud. The dreadful treatment meted out to the crew of the Shin-Ji is the most recent example of how these workers have fared in New Zealand waters. After months of exploitation, these fishermen walked off the job seeking help from our authorities. What did we do? We kicked them out of the country. These crewmen feared returning home because of the agents who hired them. Their removal from New Zealand came despite the calls the Greens and Labour made that they be allowed to stay to assist the inquiry that investigated the slave labour conditions suffered by around 2,000 mainly Asian men working on foreign chartered vessels. And a study by the University of Auckland Business School found inhumane conditions and abuse on the foreign chartered vessels. These men had been hired by Indonesian agents for as little as $260 a month. Their money was to go into a bank account in Indonesia. According to some crew, they paid only $5,000 for 22 months. I have to say, who was actually gaining from this in New Zealand? We really need to be looking at those people. Crew claimed that they were subject to sexual abuse, with claims that younger male crews were made nightly to massage the captain. Others claimed to have been assaulted. 16-hour days were expected, and one man spoke of working 30 hours straight. Sick leave or rest days were unheard of. After fleeing the boat, the crew stayed at a motel but ran out of money and food and had to appeal for help. They got some from unions, but none from the people tasked with enforcing our regulations, the Department of Labour, and I question the people that benefit from their slave labour either. Some ended up, I'm aware of, anecdotally, painting a house while they were being put up for somewhere to actually be until things were sorted out for them. Now, it might be a wee bit closer to you than you realise, Mr Bridges. The story of foreign charter vessels in our waters exposes the failure of New Zealand's elected representatives and government officials to decisively root out forced labour over the last 2 decades. Don't tempt me. In 1996, Parliament was told we have closed our eyes at home to those abuses occurring under our noses. We cannot have a commercial fishing industry develop on the backs of a third world exploited labour. Little has changed by the time the abuses of the Shin-Ji were discovered. Fishing operators continue to ignore the law. The Department of Labour continued to take a benign approach to enforcement, and crews continue to be exploited and mistreated. The Green Party will be supporting this legislation because it does make some changes. However, we consider that for this industry to be cleaned up, the Department of Labour must beef up its enforcement capabilities and it must act with a firm hand. We cannot allow these abuses to occur in our waters. The part 2 of the bill is a very important part 2, and the observers, it's fantastic that there's an increase in observers. However, the increase in observers will not go far enough for doing both protection in terms of labour or for the benefits we expect for conservation of biodiversity and for managing fishing quota. There's been a minimum of 1 observer on all foreign chartered vessels. 2 observers have been placed on vessels deemed to be of high risk to ensure 24-hour coverage. How the hang that is meant to work, factoring in shift changes, breaks, meals, health issues, etc., we definitely need more than 2 observers to ensure there's a 24/7 coverage, and that must be provided, and that hopefully will be rectified through the select committee process. We have to look at what has been spent on observers on fishing boats and how that compares with each of the last 5 years. And in this last period where this has come in, spending on observers is actually lower in the 2011-2012 period. than the previous year because no observer coverage was provided to inshore fisheries. We still need coverage there as well, despite the fact that...
Sorry to interrupt the honourable member. His time has expired.
Thank you, Mr Speaker.
I call Colin King.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. This is very important legislation. It protects human